In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there are fates worse than death. There are souls so utterly consumed by the horrors of the Immaterium that they exist in perpetual agony, trapped between realities, neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. This is the chronicle of Lysander Vex, a psyker whose gift became his eternal curse. The scream that echoes through the void between worlds is not one of pain, though pain beyond mortal comprehension courses through what remains of a soul once called Lysander Vex. It is a sound that transcends the physical, bleeding through dimensions like ichor from a wound that will never heal. Those sensitive to the warp shudder when they hear it, though they cannot say why. They feel it in their bones, in the deepest recesses of their minds where nightmares are born and sanity goes to die. It is the sound of a human soul being devoured, piece by piece, for all eternity. Lysander Vex was not always the writhing mass of psychic torment that now haunts the spaces between realities. Once, he had been a man, proud and defiant, serving aboard the Imperial Navy vessel Retribution's Edge as a sanctioned psyker. His origins were humble enough, born on the hive world of Mordian 7th, taken by the Black Ships at age 12 when his abilities manifested during a particularly vivid nightmare that killed 3 other children in the Hab block through sheer psychic feedback. The Scholastica Psychana had molded him, as it did all who survived its brutal training regimens, into a weapon of the Emperor's will. The Immaterium, that roiling sea of pure emotion and twisted thought that lies beneath reality's thin veneer, had always whispered to him. Even with his psychic hood's null field generators humming softly against his skull, even with the ritual scarification that covered his body in wards and holy inscriptions, he could feel it pressing against the barriers of his mind like hungry predators sensing weakness. The other crew members gave him a 10-wide berth, as was proper. They understood the danger he represented, the price of his service to the Golden Throne. But they could not comprehend the true horror of his existence. The constant vigilance required to keep the daemons at bay, the nightly battles fought in the landscapes of dreams where reality held no meaning. It began during the Korvax campaign, when the Retribution's Edge translated from the warp near the contested system's outermost planet. The emergence was clean, or so the navigators claimed, but Lysander felt something different the moment they breached the veil between dimensions. The warp clung to the ship like a malevolent fog, and in that fog, ancient things stirred. He tried to warn Captain Mordecai, tried to explain the wrongness that permeated the very air, but how could mortal minds comprehend what he sensed? The captain dismissed his concerns with the casual indifference of those who had never stared into the abyss and felt it stare back. The first sign of what was to come manifested during evening prayers in the ship's cathedral. As the crew intoned the familiar litanies, Lysander felt the words twist in his mouth, becoming something else entirely. The high Gothic syllables stretched and warped, taking on meanings that had never existed in any human language. He tried to stop, tried to clamp his jaw shut, but his voice continued of its own accord, weaving patterns of sound that seemed to tear small holes in the air itself. Through these microscopic rifts, things began to seep, not daemons, not yet, but the essence of the warp itself, raw and unfiltered. The other worshippers began to bleed from their eyes and ears. The ship's confessor fell to his knees, clutching his holy symbol as it grew red-hot in his hands. But the worst part was not the immediate horror. It was the realization that Lysander could feel each drop of blood as it fell, could taste the terror of every soul in that sacred space. The warp was using him as a conduit, and with each passing moment, the connection grew stronger. Commander Thaddeus ordered him confined to the Psyker containment cells deep in the ship's bowels, surrounded by blessed adamantium and ward-inscribed walls that had contained dozens of his predecessors. But the cell that had once felt like salvation now became the first ring of his personal hell. In the darkness, with only the soft hum of power fields for company, Lysander began to change. The process was gradual at first. A whisper here, a half-glimpsed shadow there, the sensation of fingers that were not quite his own flexing within his hands. Sleep became impossible, not because he feared the dreams, but because the dreams had begun to manifest in the waking world. He would close his eyes and see vast landscapes of impossible geometry, cities built from crystallized screams, oceans of liquid time that flowed backward into infinity. When he opened them again, fragments of these visions lingered at the edges of his perception. A tentacle of living shadow writhed beneath his bunk. Faces pressed against the containment field, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams that somehow reached his ears despite the vacuum of space surrounding them. The ship's astropath, an ancient woman named Seraphina, whose withered form had served the Imperium for over 2 centuries, came to him on the 7th day of his confinement. Her empty eye sockets wept tears of silver as she spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested she was not entirely present in baseline reality. "You have been chosen," she whispered, her words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The princes of chaos have marked you, child. Not for corruption, that would be a mercy. They have chosen you to be a window, a permanent breach through which they may observe our reality without the inconvenience of manifestation." Lysander tried to respond, but found that his voice had become something else entirely. When he spoke, the words emerged as a chorus of different tones and timbres, as if multiple entities were using his vocal cords simultaneously. Some spoke in languages that predated humanity, others in tongues that would not be invented for millennia to come. All carried the same message. He was no longer alone in his own flesh. The transformation accelerated after Seraphina's visit. His reflection began to lag behind his movements, sometimes showing him actions he had not yet taken, other times revealing the twisted forms that writhed beneath his skin. His shadow acquired a life of its own, stretching in directions that defied the position of light sources, sometimes splitting into multiple forms that capered and danced while his body remained perfectly still. Food became unnecessary, then impossible. His digestive system had been replaced by something that fed on psychic energy instead, drawing sustenance from the fear and anguish of the crew members who dared to approach his cell. He could feel their emotions like physical substances, could taste their nightmares and gorge himself on their terror. But this new form of nourishment came with a price. Each feeding session bound him more tightly to the entities that had made their home within his consciousness. The voices multiplied. What had begun as whispers became conversations, then arguments, then screaming matches conducted entirely within the confines of his skull. They spoke of things that had never been and never could be, of colors that existed only in the spaces between thoughts, of mathematical equations whose solutions would unravel the fundamental laws of physics. Some claimed to be daemons, others insisted they were fragments of his own psyche, driven mad by exposure to raw chaos. A few maintained they were the ghosts of previous psykers who had suffered similar fates, trapped forever in the liminal space between sanity and dissolution. Time began to lose meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, then collapsed back into themselves. He experienced his own birth and death simultaneously, felt his mother's love and the cold embrace of the grave as a single, paradoxical sensation. The past and future became equally present, equally real, until he could no longer distinguish between memory and prophecy. He saw the Retribution's edge burning in the void, consumed by warp fire that poured from his own eye sockets. He witnessed his own childhood on Mordian the 7th, but now the other children in the Hab block were not killed by psychic feedback. They were absorbed into his being, their screams joining the eternal chorus that had replaced his heartbeat. The breaking point came when the ship entered the Korvax system's asteroid belt. The ancient rocks, blasted free from planets that had died before humanity's first steps among the stars, carried traces of psychic resonance from civilizations that had fallen to chaos eons ago. These whispers from the deep past called to the entities within Lysander's flesh, and they answered with enthusiasm that shattered what remained of his human limitations. The containment field failed first, its blessed circuits overloading as raw warp energy poured through his transformed nervous system. The adamantium walls began to sweat blood, not his blood, but the life essence of creatures that existed only in mathematical theory and fever dreams. The ward inscriptions carved into every surface ignited with unholy fire, their protective symbols inverting and twisting into configurations that hurt to perceive. Captain Mordecai ordered the section sealed and vented to space, hoping that the vacuum would end whatever was happening in the containment cell. But Lysander no longer needed air to survive. He had become something that existed partially in the warp, sustained by the very forces that were consuming him. When the massive blast doors were finally breached 3 days later, The boarding party found him still alive, if the word could still be applied to what he had become. His body had been turned inside out without losing its basic humanoid shape, revealing musculature and organs that belonged to no terrestrial anatomy. His bones had become crystalline structures that hummed with psychic energy, resonating at frequencies that caused immediate madness in those who heard them. His eyes had multiplied, opening along his arms and torso and legs like malevolent flowers, each one showing a different view of reality. Some revealed the ship as it was, others showed it as it had been years ago. Still others displayed possible futures where it was consumed by demonic forces or transformed into a living vessel of chaos. But the most disturbing change was not physical. Lysander had become a conduit for something vast and ancient, a permanent gateway through which the warp could observe baseline reality without the usual restrictions of possession or manifestation. Through his transformed consciousness, entities that had existed since before the birth of stars could experience the linear progression of time, could taste the simple pleasures and pains of mortal existence without the risk of being banished back to the Immaterium. The crew tried to destroy him, of course. Bolter rounds passed through his flesh without leaving wounds, each projectile seeming to strike something that existed in a slightly different dimension. Plasma fire caused his form to flicker and distort, but he always reformed moments later, usually with additional eyes or limbs that had not been there before. A direct hit from the ship's internal defense las cannons succeeded only in opening him up further, creating new apertures through which warp entities could peer into reality. It was then that Lysander understood the true nature of his transformation. He had not been possessed or corrupted in any conventional sense. Instead, he had become a living breach in the barriers between dimensions, a permanent wound in the fabric of reality itself. The entities that spoke through his voice, that looked out through his multiplying eyes, that moved his limbs in impossible ways. They were not invading his body so much as using it as a window into a universe they could never directly enter. And the window worked both ways. Just as the warp entities could observe baseline reality through his transformed senses, Lysander found himself experiencing existence from their perspective. He saw time as a navigable dimension, witnessed the birth and death of galaxies as brief flickers of light, felt the emotional resonance of every sentient being in the sector as a constant background hum of sensation. The knowledge was simultaneously enlightening and devastating. He understood truths about the nature of existence that no human mind was meant to comprehend, and each revelation stripped away another layer of his fundamental humanity. The Retribution's Edge became a ghost ship after that, drifting through the void with a crew driven mad by prolonged exposure to Lysander's transformed presence. Those who did not succumb to insanity or suicide found themselves gradually changing as well, their own psychic potential awakened and twisted by proximity to the living breach he had become. The ship's navigator went blind, trying to plot a course back to Imperial space, her third eye burned out by visions of impossible routes through dimensions that existed only in theory. The astropath Seraphina merged with the ship's communication array, her consciousness scattered across 1,000 different transmission frequencies, forever broadcasting warnings that no one could decode. Captain Mordecai lasted longer than most, his iron will and decades of command experience providing some measure of protection against the reality-warping emanations that poured from the containment section. But even he eventually succumbed, not to madness, but to a form of enlightenment that was arguably worse. He began to understand what Lysander had become, began to perceive the cosmic significance of the transformation. In his final log entry, recorded with hands that shook with something other than fear, he wrote, "We have created a miracle and an abomination in equal measure. Through this man's suffering, we have given the warp eyes to see our world, and through our world, the warp has given him the ability to see everything else. God Emperor, forgive us, but I believe we have witnessed the birth of something that was always meant to exist." The ship was eventually found by an Inquisition task force, investigating reports of strange psychic phenomena in the Korvax system. Inquisitor Malthius, a veteran of centuries of daemon hunting and chaos corruption, declared the vessel beyond redemption after spending less than an hour aboard. His report, sealed in the deepest archives of the Ordo Malleus, described Lysander's condition in clinical terms that nonetheless conveyed the full horror of what he had witnessed. Subject has achieved a state of existence that defies classification within our current understanding of chaos corruption. He appears to have become a stable breach between dimensions, allowing entities from the Immaterium to observe our reality without the usual constraints of manifestation or possession. The implications for Imperial security are beyond calculation. They tried to destroy him, of course. Cyclone torpedoes were fired into the ship from a safe distance, their melter warheads designed to reduce even the toughest materials to component atoms. But when the flames died and the radiation cleared, Lysander remained, floating in the vacuum where the ship had been, his transformed body now sustained entirely by warp energy. The explosion had only served to free him from the physical constraints of the containment cell, allowing him to exist purely as the dimensional breach he had become. The Inquisition task force attempted to contain him using specialized equipment designed for daemon hunting, blessed containment fields powered by the faith of 1,000 battle sisters, null field generators calibrated to disrupt psychic phenomena, even an experimental weapon that fired concentrated beams of pure negation. Nothing worked. Every attempt to harm or contain him only seemed to open him up further, creating new apertures through which warp entities could peer into baseline reality. In desperation, they tried communication. Tech adepts rigged a heavily shielded Vox unit capable of translating psychic emanations into audible speech, hoping to negotiate with whatever remained of Lysander's consciousness. What they heard drove 3 of them immediately insane and left the others with permanent neural damage. It was not a single voice but a symphony of overlapping conversations, some conducted in languages that had never existed, others in mathematical concepts that bypassed speech entirely. Among the chaos of sound, they occasionally caught fragments of what might have been Lysander's original personality, pleas for help, fragments of prayers to the Emperor, desperate attempts to explain what was happening to him. But these human elements were overwhelmed by the alien perspectives that now shared his consciousness. Ancient entities that had witnessed the birth of the galaxy spoke of civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity was still learning to make fire. Demonic princes shared their views on the fundamental nature of reality, describing physics and metaphysics in terms that made mortal listeners weep tears of blood. Fragments of consciousnesses from 1,000 different species, some extinct for millions of years, others not yet evolved, chattered and argued and screamed in harmonies that rewrote the basic structure of nearby space-time. The worst part was the growing realization that Lysander was still aware, still fundamentally present within the maelstrom of competing consciousnesses. He could feel everything that was happening to him, could perceive each new layer of transformation as it stripped away another piece of his humanity. But he was powerless to stop it, trapped as a passenger in his own consciousness, while entities from beyond comprehension used his body as a window into reality. The Inquisition eventually classified him as a Class Omega psychic phenomenon and established a permanent quarantine zone around his location, hoping to contain whatever effects his presence might have on local spacetime. Ships were forbidden from approaching within a full light year of his coordinates, and even long-range sensor sweeps were conducted with the utmost caution. The few reports that filtered back described spatial anomalies that defied explanation, areas where time flowed backward, regions where the laws of physics operated according to different fundamental constants, pockets of space where the barrier between dimensions had become so thin that daemons could manifest without the usual requirements of ritual or sacrifice. But Lysander was not content to remain stationary. The entities that shared his consciousness were curious about the universe they could now observe, and they began to move him through spacetime using methods that transcended conventional physics. He would appear in different star systems without warning, his presence immediately detectable by the reality distortions that surrounded him like a malevolent aura. Each appearance was brief, rarely more than a few hours in local time, but the effects were permanent. Planets would develop new forms of life overnight, their evolution guided by alien principles that had nothing to do with natural selection. Space stations would begin broadcasting messages in dead languages, their crews transformed into prophets of cosmic truths that no human mind could safely comprehend. The most disturbing reports came from the edges of the galaxy, where Lysander had been sighted near ancient xenoarchaeological sites that predated human space travel by millions of years. These locations, already unstable due to their exposure to technologies beyond current understanding, became focal points of reality distortion when exposed to his transformed presence. Archaeological teams sent to investigate these sites found evidence of civilizations that had apparently existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their technology based on principles that treated time and space as malleable substances rather than fundamental constants. Some theorists within the Inquisition began to propose that Lysander's transformation was not random, that the entities using him as a window into reality had specific goals that transcended simple observation. They pointed to the pattern of his appearances, the way he seemed drawn to locations where the barrier between dimensions was already thin, where ancient technologies had left scars in the fabric of space-time itself. A few radical thinkers even suggested that his condition was part of a larger plan, that the Chaos Gods were using him to prepare reality for some form of fundamental transformation that would make the current universe more hospitable to warp entities. But perhaps the most chilling possibility was raised by Inquisitor Valerius, a specialist in temporal anomalies and paradox theory. After studying reports of Lysander's appearances across multiple star systems, he proposed that the transformed Psyker was not moving through space in any conventional sense. Instead, he suggested, Lysander existed simultaneously in multiple locations throughout the galaxy. His consciousness spread across space-time like a vast neural network, connecting every point where the warp had succeeded in breaching reality's defenses. Each appearance was simply a local manifestation of this larger phenomenon, a glimpse of something that was present everywhere, but visible only under specific conditions. This theory gained credibility when astropaths across the Imperium began reporting identical dreams, visions of a figure that was simultaneously human and utterly alien, standing at the center of a vast web of psychic energy that connected every star in the galaxy. In these dreams, the figure would speak in voices that were familiar, yet impossibly distorted, delivering messages that seemed to come from multiple time periods simultaneously. Some astropaths claimed the figure was warning them of dangers that had not yet come to pass. Others insisted he was describing events that had occurred millions of years ago. A few maintained that he was doing both, that his consciousness had become unstuck from linear time and now existed in a state of perpetual temporal flux. The cumulative effect of these reports was a growing awareness within certain circles of the Inquisition that Lysander Vex had become something unprecedented in Imperial history, a human being who had been transformed into a living bridge between dimensions, a permanent conduit through which the warp could interact with baseline reality without the usual restrictions of demonic manifestation or chaos corruption. He was not possessed, not corrupted in any traditional sense, but rather had become a new form of existence entirely, one that existed partially in both dimensions simultaneously. This realization led to increasingly desperate attempts to understand and potentially reverse his condition. The Inquisition established secret research facilities on isolated worlds, staffed by their most talented and expendable psykers, with the goal of mapping the exact nature of Lysander's transformation. These facilities invariably suffered catastrophic failures within months of beginning their research, their personnel either driven insane by exposure to the cosmic truths they were attempting to study, or transformed into beings that resembled their subject in disturbing ways. The few coherent reports that emerged from these doomed research efforts painted a picture of a transformation so fundamental that it challenged basic assumptions about the nature of consciousness and identity. Lysander, they suggested, had not simply been changed by his contact with warp entities. He had become a new form of life entirely, one that existed as much in the realm of pure thought and emotion as in physical reality. His consciousness had been expanded to encompass perspectives and experiences that no single mind was meant to contain, turning him into something that was simultaneously individual and collective, human and utterly alien. Perhaps most disturbing was the growing evidence that his condition was contagious, not in any biological sense, but in terms of its effect on local reality. Prolonged exposure to his presence seemed to weaken the barriers between dimensions for everyone in the vicinity, making it easier for other individuals to undergo similar transformations. Several documented cases existed of Imperial personnel who had encountered him directly and subsequently began manifesting similar symptoms: the multiplication of sensory organs, the ability to perceive multiple timelines simultaneously, the gradual replacement of human thought patterns with something far more complex and alien. The Imperium's response to this growing threat was characteristically brutal and absolute. Entire star systems where Lysander had been sighted were declared perdita and subjected to exterminatus, their populations sacrificed in the hope of containing whatever reality-warping effects his presence might have triggered. These extreme measures proved largely ineffective. The transformed Psyker seemed able to survive even the complete destruction of planetary bodies, his existence now sustained entirely by psychic energy drawn from the warp itself. More troubling still were reports that the exterminatus campaigns were actually making the situation worse. The massive psychic shock generated by the death of billions of sentient beings created resonances in the warp that seemed to strengthen Lysander's connection to baseline reality, allowing him to manifest more frequently and with greater effect. Some inquisitors began to suspect that the entities using him as a conduit had planned for this response, that they were using humanity's own defensive measures to anchor their window into reality more firmly. As the decades passed, and reports of Lysander's appearances continued to accumulate, a new understanding began to emerge within the highest levels of the Inquisition. He was not simply a victim of chaos corruption or a failed psyker who had lost control of his abilities. Instead, he had become something that represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the warp and baseline reality, a living proof that the barriers between dimensions were not as absolute as Imperial doctrine maintained. His eternal torment was not merely personal but cosmic in scope. He had become a focal point where two incompatible forms of existence intersected, creating paradoxes and contradictions that rippled outward through space-time itself. Every moment of his continued existence was an act of universe-scale vandalism, a violation of natural law that forced reality to accommodate possibilities it was never meant to contain. And yet, despite the horror of his transformation and the threat he represented to everything the Imperium stood for, there was something profoundly tragic about Lysander's fate. Deep within the maelstrom of alien consciousness that had consumed his mind, fragments of his original personality persisted, aware of what he had become but powerless to change it. He experienced every reality distortion, every breach of natural law, every moment of cosmic horror that his presence caused, but from the perspective of a human consciousness that still remembered what it felt like to be simply and purely mortal. This was his true torment, not the physical transformation, not the loss of his humanity, but the terrible awareness of what he had become and what his existence meant for the universe around him. He was condemned to serve as a window through which entities of pure malevolence could observe and influence reality, but he retained enough of his original self to understand the full implications of this role. Every star system he visited, every life his presence touched, every reality distortion that rippled outward from his transformed flesh, he experienced them all as personal failures, as evidence of his inability to protect the Imperium he had once served. The ultimate horror of Lysander Vex's fate was not that he had been transformed into something alien and terrible, but that he remained fundamentally human enough to suffer for it. His consciousness had been expanded to encompass perspectives that spanned millions of years and multiple dimensions, but at its core, it was still the mind of a man who had once believed in the Emperor's light and humanity's place in the galaxy. That belief had not been destroyed by his transformation. Instead, it had been perverted, turned into a source of infinite anguish as he was forced to serve as an instrument of the very forces he had spent his life opposing. In the end, Lysander Vex had achieved a form of immortality, but it was an immortality defined entirely by suffering. He would exist as long as the warp itself endured, serving as an eternal bridge between dimensions, a living violation of natural law that could never be healed or undone. His consciousness would expand and fragment and reconstitute itself across the vast reaches of space-time, experiencing every possible perspective on existence while remaining trapped within the fundamental paradox of his transformed nature. And somewhere in the deepest archives of the Inquisition, sealed behind locks that require the authorization of the High Lords of Terror themselves, lies a single piece of parchment containing the last coherent message ever received from Lysander Vex. It was transmitted through a heavily shielded astropathic relay during one of his early manifestations, before his transformation had progressed to its current state. The message consists of only 7 words, but they encapsulate the full scope of his eternal torment. I can see everything, and it hurts. The scream that echoes through the void continues, neither growing louder nor fading away, a constant reminder that some forms of damnation transcend even the imaginative cruelties of the chaos gods. It is the sound of a human soul stretched across dimensions, experiencing all of existence simultaneously, while remaining trapped within the limitations of a consciousness that was never meant to comprehend such vastness. And in that scream, those who listen carefully can sometimes hear an echo of their own mortality, a reminder that the barriers between sanity and madness, between human and other, are far thinner than most dare to believe. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war, but for Lysander Vex, there is something worse. There is eternal awareness, infinite perspective, and the unending knowledge that he has become the very thing he once fought against, a window through which the enemies of humanity can observe and influence the reality he spent his life defending. His torment will continue as long as consciousness itself endures, a testament to the terrible price of peering too deeply into the abyss that lies beyond the veil of mortal understanding.